Welcome to Charting Change in Legal. I'm Ari Kaplan, an analyst that covers the legal industry, and I'm here with my co-host.
Caroline Hill. I am editor-in-chief of Legal IT Insider. Ari, you sounded really great there. Like you sounded, like
I'm really working on my
yeah,
radio voice. I have a face
yeah.
for radio, so I try to make sure that it it maintains that's what happens when we record. I'm coming from swimming. It's the
I know.
chlorine. It's the chlorine in my body that elevates the depth of my voice. So
Exactly.
Caroline, we are really a month plus into the year. We're closer to Valentine's Day than we are to New Year's. It seems to be, as it always seems to be, going very quickly. And I
Yeah.
thought it'd be interesting to kind of recap the last, 5 weeks of the year so far.
Oh my goodness. What do we, yeah, how is it already how is it already nearly the middle of
Although
February?
I love the fact that we're getting further away from winter because I,
Yes,
I live in the Northeast and the winter is can be unbearable when it's in the teens. I will
um,
say that, obviously we're coming off what I thought was a well-attended legal week
yeah,
and with lots of activities, and I was lucky to host some dinners and very interesting, I thought, to see one overall observation because there was lots of discussion about AI and the implications of generative AI and where we're headed and all of the things that will happen. And I'm sure there's lots we can talk about. But one of the
yeah.
most interesting aspects of this was that the conversations about AI brought up two distinct repeat emotions. One was a discussion about your moral compass, like the ethics, and whether I was in a room full of law firm leaders or corporate leaders, the idea of what kinds of decisions you would make in what types of ethical situations seemed to keep coming up. And the other was this emotional element to AI as it relates to technology. For some reason, every time it came up in conversation, people would make a comment or give a perspective about raising their children with technology and the next generation and this really forward-looking view of the impact that this will have on the world, on them personally, how they're making decisions associated with it. It wasn't just, can you ask ChatGPT to write
Mm.
a sonnet in a business letter? It was no longer that. It was much more philosophical. And I found myself being drawn into conversations that were surprising and very deep, but seemed incongruous with the idea of just discussing technology for the sake of how that will be applied for efficiency and cost savings.
That's really interesting. That's so interesting because people are realizing the extent to which this could really change. I guess initially there was that kind of OpenAI comes on the scene, and then vendors are
Yeah,
rushing.
wow, I can write a poem and
Right, and
I
also
could write it in Spanish and it would
and
be
even
so
last
funny.
year, right? Last
Right.
year at the week, all the vendors were rushing out with their early already. Even then, right in January, there were lots of early sort of talk about different ways that they were starting to incorporate it in their products and the search, and it was very functional. It wasn't really philosophical. Whereas now, I suppose we've had another whole year to get our heads around the fact that, yeah, there's that very functional day to day, but there's also this very much bigger picture in terms of what does it mean for the whole profession and what we're going to be doing and what roles will exist and that kind of thing. I think that we've had more time to think about that.
Yeah, how can you use it responsibly? What are the parameters and what is the structure around its use? Everyone seems to incorporate it in some way. And I think that most buyers, I've just recently finished my e-discovery unfiltered report, and the buyers that I spoke to were interested in these tools and applying them, but were conservative, right? Like they weren't rushing in to any particular thing. And even at the I went to the Microsoft breakfast, which was really interesting at Legal Week, and they talked about developing guidelines for the use and incorporating individual organizations framework and policies into the deployment of the software. So it was a very interesting conversation. It certainly had changed from, hey, look at the fun stuff we can do with it, as opposed to should we do with it? How should we do it? And what are the implications of taking that action?
I'm not sure. I call me a cynic, Ari, but I mean, these conversations are great. I do feel a little bit cynical about the extent to which we have power right now. I think the power is so much in the hands of the technology companies, and I do think that that it's funny because I have conversations with lots of different vendors, and the power is really grouped with the certain players, and I do think that as collectively as a vertical, we need to really think about that. We need to think about, continuously think about, right, who has the power, what does that mean in terms of the decisions that we're making, and what we need to put in place to protect the business. I think that things have changed. But there's a part of it is growing up, right? Like, so we've, as an industry, dealt with a lot of smaller point solutions, which have been very personal relationship. It hasn't been like a SaaS, and we're now growing up. We're dealing
Hmm.
in many cases with like much bigger technology providers and cloud, which is subscription based. Obviously, that's a massive generalization, and but and they're priced differently, and some of them are more arm's length. But I do think that when it comes down to uh, what policies do you want, and how do you does this, what context, or what should you think about the context of your own business? You need to think about what power you have, and I think the answer is still not much.
Yeah, although I guess for the life cycle of development of technology, as long as I've been alive, has always been kind of centered in a small group, right? Look at the stock markets are being driven by seven companies, and they control a lot. And those companies are not new, frankly. They've been around for a long time, and they've been controlling how the deployment of technology and the development of it works. But I guess I think the most important part of this is that there's real opportunity here, and that people
Yeah.
should recognize that. And in the face of redundancies, and in the face of the industry changing, and in the face of roles being merged or redefined, some of the things that would happen at my law firm dinner, they were talking about this increasing emergence of a chief artificial intelligence officer. And I was lucky to actually speak also at the skills conference, which took place on the last day of Legal Week, separate, but it took place, and that's where all the knowledge management leaders, I think, basically in the US converge annually. And also really interesting conversations around how are those individuals who typically are the ones driving innovation and just sort of knowledge sharing in legal, how are they sort of seeing their role now
Yeah.
as opposed to a year ago, 5 years ago?
Are you able to talk about that, or is it Chatham House, that conference skills?
I was only there briefly, so I'm
Oh,
certainly
really?
happy to talk about whatever. I
You
was there to
flew
moderate
in, flew
the
out.
client. Yeah, the client. I was there to talk about the client's perspective,
Oh,
but there was a
okay.
lot of engagement, and it was a super fun, smart discussion at a
Ah,
very high level amongst people who are actually making decisions, driving change, selecting technology. So it wasn't guessing. All of these people were either using a tool, changing. For example, someone said that you can no longer say, for example, we don't use a particular technology, email, for example. This has come up a bunch. Like,
yeah.
the use of email, when the use of email came around, it was like, oh, we don't use email, we only send faxes. Well, someone
Yeah.
said things have changed so much that in our corporation, a giant corporation, we don't even use email. We only communicate through collaborative channels. So if our law firms are not at that point, it's a deficiency. So it's a really interesting. I was lucky to moderate that panel about the client's perspective, because there was like incredible sharing and generosity between the panelists and the audience. It was really, really interactive.
It,
And yeah.
sorry, it's one of my favorite. I didn't go this year, but it's one of my favorite, obviously run by Oza Banama and a bunch of other people. And yeah, I mean, what astonishes me is how much the KM the definition of KM and everything about the KM community has changed and evolved over the years. And I think the developments with Gen AI will just accelerate that further.
Well, I told a funny story, at least
Was it funny?
in my mind, it was funny. Just about having been there. Well, I was asked to produce something with Recomind. I don't know if you've ever remember that company,
Yeah,
Recomind.
I remember them
But
well.
yeah, of course, so wonderful.
Yeah.
Now owned by OpenText, and I was asked to produce this video white paper, and that's what we called it. It was essentially me interviewing people in KM, and I
Yeah.
had to go to this meeting, which was this took place 15 years ago. And I set up my tripod and my camera and a microphone as if I knew what I was doing. And I wasn't actually allowed to attend their conference because I wasn't in that
No way.
space and I wasn't invited. But I was
Right.
allowed to set up outside where they were having coffee and pastries. And so if I could somehow, persuade someone there to talk to me for a minute, so I shared this video afterward because I was so happy. I was telling them in the context of me being so happy to have finally, 15 years later, been invited into the room. So it's really an elite group of folks. I'm proud to know them and to learn from them. And it was just very funny. And I'm happy to share with our listener
You're happy to share that
or
you
listener
so
with our
basically the point of your story was that you got invited. That's not
I
what was
got invited, which I've not
got
gotten invited. 15 years later, they let me in the room, and then they immediately escorted me out of the room right after extending the invitation. And so I don't know what the conversation was when I left, but it was something like, "Do not let that guy back." But the point is, in all seriousness, I
yeah,
think
it's a
that
great
the best part of that event and others that we have been to already this year and will hopefully and be fortunate to go to is this conversation that is much more meaningful. You're seeing lots of folks convene these discussions, they help, and I just think that our industry will really grow much faster if we are more willing to share some of
yeah.
our experiences.
Hey, on that point, I really wanted to bring up with you. There was an announcement this week about there's a new group called the Sense Collective, which
Hmm.
is a group of general counsel from so far it's Intel, DXC, Microsoft, Adobe, CrowdStrike, Ford, and Anglo American, and it's being facilitated by Factor, the
Hmm.
ALSP. Um, and they created this collective to talk about generative AI. They're going to get together. They're building a community, and they're talking about that exactly to your point, right? They're saying that by rather than trying to each of them reinvent the wheel and do the same things, they want to collaborate and come up with, I think they call it a shared framework for practical implementation, not just chat, in other words. But I don't know really yet what it means. I don't think anybody does. But although I have asked to have a proper conversation about it. But it's this idea of, through having conversations, they can start to make more progress. They can accelerate progress by speaking to one another. It's another invite only thing, which I think will irritate some people. But that's obviously essential to make sure that
No,
it
but
does.
you have to make things
Exactly.
invitation only at that level
I meant,
because
I
you
meant
need
it.
people in the room who are experienced and can
Yeah.
contribute. So I don't
I
think
meant,
there's
I meant the
anything wrong with that.
tone. No, you're right. I meant the tone of it, like these kind of wait list type, like the vendors that have got these big wait lists, and it's just causing culturally this like sense of, But anyway, I think that but it's really fascinating that they're going to get together and I think this it's fascinating on lots of levels. One is the fact that they are talking, they feel the need to swap notes and collaborate in this way. Two is there are other ways of doing this, like Clock is a forum for this kind of thing. But anyway, and then but this perhaps it needs to be more agile. My assumption is that you need something smaller, more agile, and more targeted. And then
Well,
yeah, I
clock has
suppose
a framework, right? So there's a clock framework. This reminds me in many ways of the early days of e-discovery when George Sosha and Todd Gelbman had their e-discovery report and developed the EDRM,
yeah,
and that has sustained for decades. I mean, it's really been helpful for the industry to just define what activity sits where along this continuum. And I hope groups like that produce something that they can share at a scholarly level and
Yeah.
then try to figure out structurally how to implement. And I'm fortunate in that I get to have conversations with folks at all of these different points, whether they're in legal operations or the general counsel or a paralegal or a law firm partner or a litigation support leader or kind of any or a roundtable discussion with CEOs of legal tech companies. So I just feel like my goal is to just understand what their challenges are, like you as a journalist, right? What are the challenges? Where are their opportunities? Where are their solutions? And what are the gaps that need to be filled? And I think that was also very helpful. Legal Week, other conferences that are coming up are helpful to try to understand who fills which gaps.
Yeah.
And that way you can be a resource for others. When I read your work on new initiatives or programs that you're facilitating, I get a sense of, wow, I didn't know that this organization actually existed to solve this particular problem. I've only heard from the people I've spoken to for my research frustrations of a problem. But when I get to then see so many organizations in one place, I then I can go back to those people and say, I saw this and this and this seems to solve your problem or at least worthy of a conversation with those people.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, no, it's a really good point about the EDRM point and the frame. I mean, I love that. So yeah, so maybe that is what will come out of it. And I mean, the only slight thing I think I've talked a little bit in the past about the balance of the sort of shift of power that Gen AI will have between law firms and corporates. And if I was a law firm looking at this, I must admit I would be a little bit nervous. I'm not going to lie, like because and it's inevitable and there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not, I'm not trying to stir anything, but it's just a case of I think that Gen AI will shift more power to corporates, and I think that it'll be really fascinating to see what the kind of that this is going to be a long running conversation, right? We're going to have initial thoughts and then we're going to have, it's just going to continue, but it would be fascinating to see, some of what the initial thoughts and steps that come out of this.
Yeah, and then we're like entering a really interesting period of the year. So Legal Week has just occurred. It
Mm.
took place at the beginning of the year. Next year, it will be back to end of March,
Yeah.
which will appeal to the people who prefer better weather. But it does sort of set the tone in some respect from a product standpoint, from a launch standpoint. And now you'll have Clock that comes up in
May.
May,
End of May,
and
yeah.
you'll have ILTA that comes up in the summer. You'll have, other conferences are taking place, the ALA, the LMA. There are other things that are happening. So you're going to have conversations like this at many different levels with many different constituencies within our uh, profession. But I think there is this kind of quiet period, I guess, up until the ABA Tech Show, which will happen soon as well. I think it's
Mm.
actually very soon. So
Yeah.
once that's over, you'll have this sort of quiet period in some respect where people go back and start thinking about what they've heard, what they've learned, how do they implement it, where is there a solution they can use, what does their budget look like, how can they adapt? And I think that's a place where I look forward to you and I having more of a conversation because it's just a richer understanding during that quiet period of having taken some lessons and then trying to figure out how do we now execute throughout the rest of the year.
Mm. Okay. Quiet. I don't think we're going to get that much quiet. I don't know. I was thinking this is going to be quiet. Christmas was going to be quiet. It's just not. It's just it
Well, I
doesn't.
just mean where it will be in
I
between
know. I
events. Yeah,
know.
we'll be in between events for a little while. The events seem to be like compressed, so
Yeah.
people are going from place to place. And once there's a month here or a month there, I guess I'm also thinking that I have some research that I have to produce in the first quarter. So we're like a little bit into, almost at the midpoint of the first quarter. So in my mind, I'm thinking in terms of 6 week periods, and that's where we are now. So anything you're looking forward to in the remainder of this quarter, next quarter?
Um, I've got so much on. Just try to do some dives into, there's lots of big stories that are going on and trying to sort of be mindful about, really sort of rather than just be rushed off my feet thinking, responding really quickly, just, oh, let's just write that. Really start to ask questions. There's some redundancy stuff going on and I'm trying to be thoughtful about that and have a think about what's happening there and from there's a vendor that's making some redundancies, and my current thing that's on my desk, as it were, this is maybe not representative of the entire quarter, hopefully, but is, thinking about the makeup of vendors as we go forward, particularly as, legal tech vendors, we move into this cloud era, and they're trying to work out what shape they need to be as they adapt and as they invest in cloud technology. And that means there are, in the one case that I'm looking at, there are redundancies, and whether that's right, whether that's fair, whether it's good for the client, what the industry needs, and what we need to be thinking about. So that's kind of some of the things that I'm thinking about as we transition, because obviously it's not all Gen AI, we still very much got the cloud agenda, although it's not really a conversation anymore of will you, but lots of firms, as
Right.
you know.
Much more about it, logistics.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. But lots
Yeah.
of firms are not in the cloud, and lots of vendors do not have a fully developed cloud offering, right? Like, so that, in certain parts of the sector, it's still very much they need to invest and they need to develop, and these are big dominant players, some of them. So I think that's going to be fascinating, as we sort of what does it mean for the shape of of vendors, as they sort of transition to the different needs going forward.
And I wanted to just address before we go the point about redundancies. And I thought it would be helpful to just give people some suggestions for how to address that, because I think it's great to like a LinkedIn post and to write a nice comment that you're with people, but people who are in that situation will really appreciate you sharing a job listing you may have seen, making an introduction, like being more proactive. If each of us took one step to be just slightly more proactive than click like, which is nothing wrong with it. Again, you want to support a comment about it, you want to add something, that's great. But in that situation, simply making an introduction to someone that seeing a job listing and maybe reaching out to somebody and saying it, sharing that job listing, those are very practical things that anybody can do. And
Yeah.
it sort of demonstrates a level of generosity without actually doing anything. But that thoughtfulness can be really powerful in that moment. That is a very difficult moment. And yet, if you can sort of empower those people who are feeling in the moment somewhat powerless, it really develops a strength to your relationship over the long term. And they could just something that people should consider as you're seeing more of this news and as people try to figure out what their next step is. So, Caroline Hill, it's always a privilege.
That was a very emotional, positive and uplifting way to finish, Ari. I think that's an amazing shout.
Ari Kaplan, I love it. Well, thank you so much. I'm here every 2 weeks. So please, for our one listener, we thank you for being here. We want to acknowledge you. So you'll just send us your name at some point and we will mention it on the air live in a
This is a
recording.
shout. Send us your name if you listen in and we'll
That-
read it out.
That's
We think
right.
we're on the radio.
That's
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.